Are you going to replace this archivist and get someone who actually protects the legacy of the United States and doesn't persecute political appointments?
Well, the one who was there was a disaster, and he turned out to be wrong. Well, I think I can tell you that we will get somebody, yes. Let me just put it yeah, we will have a new archivist.
Donald Trump's classified documents case began when the National Archives, America's official library, alerted the Justice Department nearly 3 years ago that Trump may have been hoarding classified documents after leaving the White House. That eventually led to the FBI's search of his Mar-a-Lago home in Florida and to Trump becoming the first former president charged with federal crimes. To say Trump is still a little sore over that would be an understatement. So it's not a surprise that he says he wants to replace the head of the National Archives for doing their job like they've done with every prior administration. The woman he wants to replace is Colleen Shogan, but she was not in the top post at the time the DOJ was tipped off. The archivist at that time was a man by the name of David Ferrero, who retired a few months after reaching out to the DOJ. Shogan was only nominated by President Joe Biden days before the FBI searched Mar-a-Lago, and she was not confirmed until the following year. Of course, none of that matters to Trump, who continues to throw temper tantrums over the archives to this day. Interestingly enough, Shogan appears to have been trying to ingratiate herself to Trump and to his followers. That includes, as the Wall Street Journal reported, altering some of the exhibits at the National Archives Museum that, quote, sought to de-emphasize negative parts of U.S. history, like removing references to landmark events such as the government's displacement of indigenous tribes and the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. One change to an exhibit involved swapping a photo of Martin Luther King Jr. marching for civil rights for former President Nixon greeting Elvis. In part, the alterations were over, quote, concerns that planned exhibits and educational displays expected to open next year might anger Republican lawmakers who share control of the agency's budget, or a potential Trump administration. And let's not forget, Shogan even invited former First Lady Melania Trump to speak at a naturalization ceremony at the archives at the end of 2023. In a statement to the readout, the National Archives said Dr. Shogan has had a strong working relationship with President Trump and his team. We look forward to continuing that relationship with the new administration. Yeah, but for Trump, none of that matters. Someone has to pay for the Mar-a-Lago raid, and that seems to be Dr. Shogan, even though she wasn't in charge when it happened. But before she gets shown the door, there is one thing she could do to improve her legacy as the National Archivist. She could publish the Equal Rights Amendment and formally recognize it as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution, making sex-based equality explicit in said Constitution for the first time. Last month, Shogan claimed she could not legally certify it due to established legal, judicial, and procedural decisions, though many have argued that not to be the case. President Biden could also choose in his final days in office to order her to publish it and make it the 28th Amendment. I'm joined now by Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor, MSNBC legal analyst, and co-host of the Sisters-in-Law podcast, one of my favorite names of a podcast. Okay, so Jill Wine-Banks, the Department of Justice has one of these memos, and this memo says that the 28th Amendment cannot be published because the deadline passed in the 1970s, and therefore only Congress can authorize that deadline to be moved. But that memo isn't law, right? Like, does that memo mean anything really, the Office of Legal Counsel memo?
I think that you have it exactly correct, Joy. It is only a policy decision. It's an opinion from the Department of Justice, which, of course, could review it and alter it. And there is a very strong legal argument that because the timeline that was given was in the preamble and not in the text of the Equal Rights Amendment, that it should have no legal impact, that it wasn't what was sent to the states. The states voted on the language of the Equal Rights Amendment, not on the preamble, and therefore the timeline should not count at all. And therefore, it has met all of the requirements. It has been approved by 3/4 of all the states, and under the Article 5 of the Constitution, that's all that it takes. And once 3/4 of the states, 38 states, ratify, it is the law of the land, and it just needs to be published. Publishing by the archivist is a ministerial act, and she should do it. She does seem to be maybe auditioning to stay on under Trump, although today he said he was going to fire her, even though, as you pointed out, she is not the one responsible for the search at Mar-a-Lago, because that was her predecessor, not her. But it should be a neutral person anyway. It should not be. It should be someone who follows the law. I think the Department of Justice should revise the Office of Legal Counsel. There are a lot of scholars who believe that the timeline is not an impactful thing, that it is not effective to stop the publication and this becoming the law of the land. And if I could just add, we really need it, especially with the incoming Trump administration. You have Title IX and Title VII that could be wiped out. You could go back to the time when I graduated law school before we had those things. I was interviewing for jobs and was asked questions like, what kind of birth control do you use? How many children are you going to have? Those were questions that were quite legal back then. Women could not get loans without a male countersigner. We don't want to go back to those days. We need the Equal Rights Amendment. I've been fighting for it since I lost my Hatch Act prohibition. So in 1976, when I left the Department of Justice, the Special Prosecutor's Office, I've been working for this for almost 50 years. And it's time for this to be the law of the land.
And by the way, Phyllis Schlafly, those of you who remember Phyllis Schlafly and have seen the great series about her, Mrs. America, she made it her business to fight against the ERA starting in the 1970s. This is before Roe, guys, if you aren't familiar with this. It took until the 2000s, I think it was like 2014 or something, that the 38th state finally ratified it. So it's taken decades for it to finally get ratified by the 38 states that are required, but it now has the 38 states. This is the thing we need to understand. All that's standing between that and being the 28th Amendment is Joe Biden ordering this woman who's trying to, make Donald Trump like her. He's never going to like you, ma'am. Dr. Shogan, you're out. You might as well publish it. That's all she has to do.
It would be a wonderful legacy for President Biden to have this be the 28th Amendment and be effective. And 80% of the public supports the Equal Rights Amendment. It's needed. It's supported. It should be the law. There is no reason for it not to be. I hope that in the next 2 weeks it happens and that we can go about our business feeling that we have protection. In the meanwhile, states must start passing equal rights amendments. And I think President Biden, at the very least, could encourage states to start doing that. And Illinois was way ahead of it on that. Other states need to do it.